Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a phrase you've probably tossed around a million times without giving it a second thought. I'm talking about trials and tribulations. Now, I absolutely promise you, by the end of this explainer, you are never going to look at this everyday idiom the same way again. We're going on a little trip, starting with some quirky rules of grammar and ending up at some surprisingly gruesome ancient agricultural practices. Let's get right into it. So, have you ever noticed how weird it is that we literally can't swap the order of these two words? I mean, imagine looking at a friend who's having a terrible week and saying, "Man, you've really faced a lot of tribulations and trials lately." It just sounds wrong, doesn't it? Our brains totally reject it. Well, there's actually a scientific reason for that. Let's dive in and figure out exactly why they're stuck that way and what this phrase actually means at its very core. Okay, at a basic, surface level, trials and tribulations just refers to the challenges and hardships we face in life. Specifically, the kind of stuff that forces us to endure a real test of our strength and fortitude. And, it's an idiom we toss around pretty lightly these days, right? We use it to describe the chaos of planning a massive holiday party, the sleepless nights of a business startup, or the sheer exhaustion of single motherhood. But as you'll see, there is a massive, heavy weight to this phrase that we've kind of just forgotten over the years. Section 1. The Science of Stickiness, Irreversible Binomials. So before we get into the heavy historical stuff, we get to ask, why are these words locked together in that exact order? Well, linguists actually have a term for this structure. It's called an irreversible binomial. You might also hear it referred to as a frozen binomial or a binomial freeze. Introduced as a concept back in the 1950s, this is basically a pair of words that belong to the same part of speech. They're connected by and or, and they are used together in a fixed, completely unchangeable order. It's essentially a super sticky linguistic mechanic that just locks the words in place. And you see this concept playing out all over the English language. We've got opposites, like black and white, or life or death. We've got rhyming or related pairings, like macaroni and cheese or wear and tear. But trials and tribulations falls into that top category on the list, alliteration. It survives and thrives specifically because of that catchy, repetitive tr sound. It's the exact same linguistic glue that gives us phrases like rock and roll or spick and span. You wouldn't say roll and rock, and for sure you don't say tribulations and trials. Section 2. Crushing weights and threshing sleds, the ancient etymology. All right, so we know why they're stuck together, but where did these words actually come from? This timeline maps out the chronological journey. It starts way back in ancient Greece, moves through ancient Rome, evolves into the Old French of the Middle Ages, and finally lands in Middle English. And what's really wild as we trace this history is that these words, they did not start out as gentle, poetic metaphors. No, they started as incredibly intense, literal agricultural and legal terms. Take the ancient Greek word thlipsis. The concept of tribulation is super closely tied to this word. Medically, they used it to describe your pulse, literally, pressure. Agriculturally, it meant pressing grapes together in a massive wine press to squeeze out the juice. But legally, it was way darker. Under ancient English law, if someone willfully refused to enter a plea, heavy stone weights were placed on their chest until they were pressed and crushed to death. That unimaginable pressure, that literal crushing weight, was thlipsis. We're not talking about a mild discomfort here. It is a life-threatening, overwhelming squeeze. Then we have the Latin root for tribulation, the tribulum, and this is where it gets really visceral. A tribulum was a heavy timber board, and it was fitted underneath with flint or sharp iron teeth. In ancient Rome, oxen would drag this heavy, spiked sled directly across harvested wheat on a rock-hard threshing floor. The whole goal was to violently tear the grain loose from the stalks, separating the valuable seeds from the worthless straw and chaff. If you pause and imagine a heavy, spiked sled being dragged over a person, you really start to grasp the sheer, terrifying weight of what a tribulation was originally meant to describe. Section 3. The ultimate test of character. Biblical evolution. So how in the world did these brutal, crushing agricultural tools turn into a metaphor for human character? Well, the answer lies in theology. The New Testament essentially reframed the whole concept of suffering. Instead of viewing that crushing pressure purely as a punishment, it started to be seen as a profound spiritual test. Just take a look at this quote from the book of James. "Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds." Now, why on earth would you consider that joy? Well, because as the text goes on to explain, the testing of your faith develops perseverance and maturity.
All of a sudden, the crushing pressure of the winepress and the violent teeth of the threshing sled were seen as tools to refine the human soul.
And later thinkers took this idea and just brilliantly expanded on it. The theologian Martin Luther actually argued that tribulation acts like a giant magnifying glass for the human soul. He believed that whatever is fundamentally inside of you is exactly what's going to be squeezed out when you're put under the intense pressure of thlipsis. So if you're inherently wise, gentle, and humble, the crushing weight just makes you more so. But on the flip side, if you're carnal, angry, or wicked, that intense pressure is just going to force more of that toxicity right to the surface. We get another amazing historical perspective from the 19th century preacher Charles Spurgeon, who adds this incredible evocative metaphor. He called it the furnace of affliction. Think about how a blacksmith uses intense heat to burn away the impurities, or the dross, from pure gold. In that exact same way, trials and tribulations were viewed as a totally necessary, even if incredibly painful, mechanism for ultimate self-improvement.
Section 4. Hardship versus a true test.
Now, this brings us to an absolutely crucial nuance between two concepts that we constantly mix up in modern English. Let's compare them side by side. First, we have a hardship. A hardship is severe suffering or deprivation that just makes life difficult. Honestly, it's just pain. It doesn't necessarily have a higher purpose or a hidden lesson attached to it. But then, we have trials and tribulations. Remember the tribulum, that spiked Roman sled? A tribulation inherently implies a test. It's an event specifically designed to prove the worth of something, to literally separate the wheat from the chaff in your own character, and ideally to vastly improve the person who manages to face it successfully. So, let's take a quick second to summarize everything we've unpacked in this explainer today. We started out with the grammar, realizing this phrase is an irreversible binomial, permanently locked in place because our brains just love that catchy T alliteration. But scratching beneath that linguistic surface, we found these incredibly intense, literal roots: the crushing pressure of the winepress, the heavy stone weights of ancient law, and the iron teeth of a Roman threshing sled. Then we saw how, over time and through a biblical lens, those brutal physical realities evolved into a really beautiful metaphor for the ultimate test of human character. It became completely distinct from just everyday hardship, carrying this implicit promise of a major character upgrade for anyone who can endure the weight. Which brings us to our final thought. The very next time you find yourself facing a seemingly impossible, incredibly stressful situation, I really want you to ask yourself, is your current challenge just a hardship, or is it a tribulation, a heavy threshing board meant to tear away the things you no longer need and separate your own wheat from the chaff? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and as always, keep learning.